Come on in. We're going to be in Acts chapter 24 today. So I'm starting the lesson today with an apology and a clarification. So I referenced Caesarea Philippi last week, which is incorrect. My sweet wife reminded me, Jeff, there's two Caesareas, make sure you get the right one. So Caesarea Philippi is way up there around, it's like 25 miles north of the Sea of Galilee at the foot of Mount Hermon. That's Caesarea Philippi. That's where Peter made his confession, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Jesus said, "Upon this rock I will build my church." And that's where that situation, that passage took place, was in Caesarea Philippi. That's not where we are, okay? We are clear down here in Caesarea, and I felt a little bit better when I was doing some research. You'll notice that sometimes they call it Maritima, Caesarea Maritima, maritime, ocean, to help remind and clarify that this is the other Caesarea. So I guess I'm not the only one to occasionally get it confused. Get mixed up in my Caesareas, just like I get mixed up in my Herods, right? I get lost in the Herods pretty fast and have to really focus on who's who. But these are two different places, and I had another map that's a little closer. So there's Caesarea Philippi. This is, you can see Capernaum down here. So this is the Sea of what? Oh, everybody passes their geography test today. Yeah, good. So yeah, there's Caesarea Philippi. This is Mount Hermon up here. And then the next slide is, there's Caesarea. And I tried to show just the tip. So if Galilee's up here, what is this body of water right there? You can see the edge of it. Dead Sea, very good. So Jerusalem would have been just a little bit over here. And there's Bethel and Ai, some of those other places. So they came through Antipatris, you'll remember. Antipatris is not on this map. It was about halfway between Jerusalem, so it was around in here someplace. And then on up to Caesarea on the coast. So sorry about that confusion. Caesarea Philippi's up by Mount Hermon. Caesarea Maritima, or just Caesarea, is on the coast. I did some interesting study on Herod's Harbor, which was just north on the coast from his praetorium. So we believe Paul's being kept at the praetorium, but just north is where Herod built this harbor. And the traffic, the ocean traffic, the trade, would come across the top of Africa, the southern part of the Mediterranean Sea, and because of the prevailing winds and just the way trade went, they would bring goods from northern Africa and Egypt and along through there, bring it up through that Palestine area and up through Asia Minor and on over to Rome. I mean, it was just, they called it a counterclockwise trade route, and it kind of flowed like that. But off the coast of Africa and on up through this area, through this region where Caesarea Philippi is, there wasn't any harbors. And Josephus says it wouldn't take just the freshest of winds, I think was the term he used, would cause huge waves to come up and put ships at risk getting driven into the rocks. So Herod built this 40-acre breakwater. And it was interesting. He used, do we have any civil engineers in here? I was kind of hoping we might have a civil engineer, being S&T and all, right? There's apparently a kind of cement called hydraulic cement that you can use. It actually hardens underwater. And the Romans had a version of this, an early version of this, made from pozzolana ash from the Bay of Naples. It was a particular kind of ash. They would mix it, and they could sink pylons forms into the ground, into the ocean floor, and fill them with this pozzolana ash, and this stuff would harden up underwater. And they would build these, from the seafloor up, they would build these huge breakwaters. And he did this and had a 40-acre protected area in his harbor where ships could come. So you can imagine what that did for trade right there, right? These ships could come in and find harbor. They could unload cargo. They could do all kinds of things. So pretty interesting and actually a remarkable feat of engineering that they were able to pull this off that long ago. And I was really hoping we would have if you know a civil engineer or somebody that knows about underwater pylon construction, ask them about that, because I just found that really fascinating. There were portions of that breakwater that were not built as solid as they could have been. The pozzolana ash, that hydraulic concrete that they made, did not set up as well as it should have, and it did cause portions of that to collapse later. And of course, none of that harbor's left now, but just ruins, and you can see them from above pretty well where the harbor used to be. Now this is, so what I was referring to, his harbor was way on up here, just a little ways on the other end of this city. This is his praetorium right here, Herod's palace, Herod's praetorium. So I did learn a few things. The water here, can you believe how clear that is? You can like see to the bottom. It's, they say at max it's 26 feet deep right there now. A lot of this has grass on it. It's kind of grown up because of just natural silting and sand getting washed up. But that is some really clear water. There was a pool here that was nearly Olympic sized, 115 by 59 feet. Had a place for what they believe was a statue right in the middle of it. There's an aqueduct that came into Caesarea Philippi, and there's channels that they have found on the side of the praetorium, and they believe that this thing may have been filled with fresh water, not ocean water, so people could swim in fresh water. This was where Herod or whoever was in authority at the time would live, in this lower area. This was more administrative offices, and they believe this is probably where Paul was kept, although I saw another note that it may have been a nearby location. But you can see the theater, the hippodrome, where they would have chariot races and games and that kind of thing there. Can you imagine what this place, especially the lower palace, the pool was surrounded by three series of colonnades on this side. Can you imagine what it would be like to stay at that place? Just a remarkable, beautiful place that jutted out into the Mediterranean. I think I've got a shot, yeah. So you can see the Mediterranean. This is a ground level shot. And you can see the Mediterranean out here. I did like this shot because it gave us a person. So you can kind of get an idea of scale and how big it is. There's another shot. And this is, they believe that Paul might have been kept in one of these areas here, one of these rooms. And as Dr. Manner pointed out last week, yes, he was a prisoner, but what did they know about Paul and his citizenship at this point? He was Roman, right? So they're not going to treat him really bad. So he's under, I think what we would call it today, protective custody. They were watching out for him and protecting him, but he did have some freedoms. We'll look at that a little bit more. Okay, let's take a look at Felix the governor from Dr. Manner.
When Paul was taken into custody in Jerusalem and the commander of the fortress
Let me pause and go back. Do we have audio for that? Ready, Jim? Okay.
When Paul was taken into custody in Jerusalem and the commander of the fortress is trying to figure out what all is going on, and then they find out the plot that has been put against Paul to kill him, the commander decides he needs to send Paul off to Caesarea in order to protect him and also then eventually to find out what's going on. And so as we read in the text, and he called to him 2 of the centurions and said, "Get 200 soldiers ready by the 3rd hour of the night to proceed to Caesarea with 70 horsemen and 200 spearmen." They were also to provide mounts to put Paul on and bring him safely to Felix the governor. And he wrote a letter having this form: Claudius Lysias, to the most excellent governor Felix, greetings. Who is this Felix? Well, he's a rather interesting character, rather colorful in the ancient world. Some things about him: he was a freedman, formerly a slave connected with the household of Emperor Claudius, and he was particularly close to Claudius's mother, Antonia, who issued apparently his freedom. He also then was a close friend of Emperor Claudius, and they were associates as probably children growing up. He had worked as a subordinate administrator in the province of Palestine from 48 to 52 AD, but then he becomes the prefect, procurator, governor of the region, ruling Palestine from 52 to 59 AD. It was the first time that a Roman procuratorship has been held by a freedman. And so Felix brings to the task a sort of colorful kind of background and a perspective that is a little different than most of the procurators. The area that he governs is fairly large. It certainly would include Caesarea Maritima as well as Jerusalem, and of course this is why Paul is sent off for custody under his care. The Romans generally did not care for Felix. Now, admittedly, we don't have a lot of sources to which to go, but as we look at them, they typically denigrated him as they would speak of him. Tacitus says, "Felix indulged in every kind of barbarity and lust, exercised the power of a king in the spirit of a slave." Obviously, he doesn't think very highly of him. He continues, "Felix thought that he could do any evil act with impunity and stimulated disloyal acts." He also conspired to assassinate Jonathan, who was the high priest, and Josephus describes this act on his part. Clearly, he was a pretty evil, corrupt individual, and I think probably deserving of the poor assessment on the part of the Romans. But he also married 3 queens, or maybe we should say 3 women who became queens. And among those was Drusilla, mentioned here in Acts chapter 24. And she was the daughter of Herod Agrippa I. She had divorced her first husband in order to marry Felix. And she and their son, eventually, who also was named Agrippa, she and her son eventually died in the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD, more popularly connected with the destruction of Pompeii. Felix had a second wife, I think in succession here, also who apparently was named Drusilla, but this is not the same Drusilla. This was the granddaughter of Cleopatra and Antony. And then there's a third woman that comes on the scene whose name is unknown. As Felix was procurator of the region, he issued some coinage. And here are the 2 examples. The top example is the front and back of a coin, and then the bottom example is the front and back. And these were issued in 54 AD, about the time that Nero begins his reign, and also when Felix has recently come on the throne. As Paul goes in to talk to Felix, it's interesting, especially with his background of his corruption and the perspective that the Romans tended to have of him. It's interesting that the Bible says he discussed with Felix on a number of occasions of righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come. pretty bold kind of behavior on the part of Paul, especially since in a very real sense his life is sort of in the balance. Felix, however, manifesting his apparently corrupt nature, calls Paul in for an audience, hoping that Paul would be able to give him money, whether through friends or whatever, but he's basically looking for a bribe. And of course, Paul never agrees to that, and this apparently goes on for the span of about 2 years. But as we think in terms of Paul's boldness in the presence of this man who pretty clearly is a rather corrupt individual, I think we need to recognize the courage that Paul exhibits, even in the face of potential adversity. It should serve as an example to us. The Bible teaches, and Paul teaches, that all who would live godly in Christ Jesus will suffer persecution. And while Paul is not looking for persecution, he recognizes the greater goal is to get the message of God out, a lesson all of us need to take to heart.
Pretty interesting background on Felix there, which gives us a little more information when we get to the end of this chapter. Let's look at the first couple of verses here, verse and a half of chapter 24. And after 5 days, the high priest Ananias came down with some elders and a spokesman, one Tertullus. They laid before the governor their case against Paul. Okay, so how many days have elapsed before Paul's, how many? 5 days go by. Who's included in this group that comes down? Elders. And a hired gun, right? So they brought somebody who was a real good orator, and we kind of see this coming up, right? When we get into the text, we see how this guy just is pretty flowery. Tertullus is his name, and they bring him to be their spokesperson to Felix. Okay. And it says they laid before the governor their case against Paul. So let's, who spoke first there in verse 2? And when he had been summoned, who? Tertullus, right? So the spokesman speaks up. So Felix apparently says, you guys start off. Tertullus breaks into his oration, his introduction. Let's look at the second part of 2 here, and we'll read through 9. Since through you we enjoy much peace, and since by your foresight, most excellent Felix, reforms are being made for this nation, in every way and everywhere we accept this with all gratitude. But to detain you no further, I beg you in your kindness to hear us briefly. For we have found this man a plague, one who stirs up riots among all the Jews throughout the world and is a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. He even tried to profane the temple, but we seized him. By examining him yourself, you will be able to find out from him about everything of which we accuse him. The Jews also joined in this charge, affirming that all these things were so. Okay, so what flowery compliments does this Tertullus throw at Felix to start things off? What does he say? There in 2. We have all this peace because of you. What else? Yes, because of your foresight, most excellent Felix, reforms are being made for this nation, and we accept this with gratitude. I mean, this guy is laying it on thick, trying to sway Felix. Well, obviously, this is not his first rodeo, as we would say. Tertullus knew what he was doing. So how would you describe Tertullus's segue in verse 4? He kind of goes from the introduction kind of right into the meat of things. How would you describe that? More flowery, right? Yeah. Yeah, I don't want to take too much of your valuable time. You're a busy man, we know that, but I would like to share something very important with you. Briefly. Yeah, briefly. So he kind of gets right into the meat of things. So he makes 3 accusations in verse 5. Well, 5 and 6. What's the first one? Stirs up riots among all the Jews. Ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. Tried to profane the temple. But we seized him. And it's interesting, if you've got an ESV and some other versions, your text goes from verse 6 to verse 8. Anybody have a Bible like that? Okay. Verse 7 is not in every ancient manuscript. It's in some, but not all. So a lot of the translations don't include verse 7 in the text, but they include it in a footnote. And the footnote for verse 7 says, and we would have judged him according to our law, but the chief captain Lysias came and with great violence took him out of our hands, commanding his accusers to come before you. So how close is that to the truth? Did Lysias with great violence?
Snuck him out in the middle of the night.
Yeah. Yeah, and actually the only violence that was going on was when they were beating the tar out of Paul, as when they threw him out of the temple and they were beating him, and then the soldiers show up and everybody kind of steps back. You can just see that whole scene in your mind. So that's a pretty good stretch of the truth there in 7, if your Bible has 7. So let's go to 21:29. Let's go back, because there's a little bit different flavor here. '21, 29. So you remember that they were concerned that Paul had brought a Greek across that barrier line in the temple area where it said, if you're not Jewish, you can't cross this barrier, the balustrade. 29 says in chapter 21, for they had previously seen Trophimus the Ephesian with him in the city, and they supposed that Paul had brought him into the temple. Never saw him do it, they just supposed. Tertullus says here that he tried to profane the temple, but we seized him. So again, he's slanting the whole story towards their case and away from Paul. Which is, when you think about what God intended the Jewish people to be, he intended them to be 100% truthful, never bear false witness, never share something that is not 100% the truth. God expects the same thing of us today as Christians, to always tell the truth. And Tertullus is bending that, if not stomping all over the truth in a couple places. So he's definitely slanting things in favor of the Jewish side of this argument. Okay. Yeah. So what does Tertullus recommend in verse 8? What does he say should be done? What's he say to Felix? Anybody? Examine him yourself, and you'll find that these things are true. You'll find out from him about everything of which we accuse him. So how did the rest of the Jewish group respond to this? This is almost comical. Yeah, what he said, yeah. It's like, this is almost comical as the way this plays out. So Tertullus lays this big flowery argument, big slanted accusation, and the Jews that are off to the side in this hearing room, wherever they happen to be, are saying, yeah, he's right. Yeah, we saw that. You tell him, Tertullus. You know, just very slanted. And then Paul gets up. So let's continue. Let's read 10 through 21. And when the governor had nodded to him to speak, Paul replied, and you can just kind of see this room, it kind of quiets down for a second. And Felix looks over at Paul and does this. He just gives him a little nod. And Paul begins to speak. Here's Paul. Knowing that for many years you have been a judge over this nation, I cheerfully make my defense. You can verify that it is not more than 12 days since I went up to worship in Jerusalem. And they did not find me disputing with anyone or stirring up a crowd, either in the temple or in the synagogue or in the city. Neither can they prove to you what they now bring up against me. But this I confess to you, that according to the way, which they call a sect, I worship the God of our fathers, believing everything laid down by the law and written in the prophets, having a hope in God, which these men themselves accept, that there will be a resurrection of both the just and the unjust. So I always take pain to have a clear conscience toward both God and man. Now, after several years, I came to bring alms to my nation and to present offerings. While I was doing this, they found me purified in the temple without any crowd or tumult. But some Jews from Asia, they ought to be here before you to make an accusation, should they have anything against me, or else let these men themselves say that what wrongdoing they found when I stood before the council. Other than this one thing that I cried out while standing among them, it is with respect to the resurrection of the dead that I am on trial before you this day. I love this. So Paul makes a pretty clear defense. Felix nods to him. He speaks. How did Paul acknowledge Felix in his introduction? Was it as flowery as?
He's been a judge for a few years. He just states a fact.
He just states a fact. He doesn't really lay on all the peanut butter and jelly that Tertullus did when he was making his introduction. Acknowledges his authority. You've been judge over this nation for years, so I cheerfully make my defense. How does Paul speak to the timeline and the evidence? So they said that Tertullus made it sound like Paul had been doing this forever and he had been causing trouble all this time. What did Paul say? How long did Paul say he had been in Jerusalem?
No more than 12 days.
12 days. I've been there 12 days. The stirring up riots in the temple and the city, how does he controvert that? What does Paul say about that? Actually, he kind of lays out, this is interesting because this is what James and the elders in Jerusalem told him to do, right? Was to purify himself, to take these 4 other men and go through this ritual in the temple. And Paul actually uses that here. He says what? What was he doing? Actually, he says first, what had he been doing? He'd been traveling for years. I've been traveling for years. Thought I would come home, and I went through a purification ritual, and these folks found me in the temple during that ritual. I wasn't causing any trouble. I didn't cause trouble in the city. I didn't cause trouble in the temple. And that can be verified. So he completely contradicts the testimony that Tertullus shares. What does he say about proof there in verse 13. They have no proof. They're making accusations, but they have no proof. So there's no substance to their accusations. What does Paul confess with regards to their accusations there in 14 through 16? He says, I am a follower of the way, which they call a sect. He said, I worship the God of our fathers. I have a hope in God. I follow the law and the prophets, and he says, I have a hope in God which these men accept, that there's going to be a resurrection from the dead for the just and the unjust. So he's saying, yeah, I am a member of the way. I do follow God. I believe in what he shared in his word, and just like these men do, and I believe in the resurrection just like these men do. So where's the beef, right? How does he address the timeline there in 17 again? What is the several years? What's going on during the several years? His missionary journeys, right? So he's been traveling all over the place, sharing the message of Jesus with others. He decides to return to Jerusalem. So based on what Paul shares, how threatening does Paul make his arrival and appearance sound? Does Paul sound pretty threatening at this point? Not at all. Sounds like somebody that just is coming to worship, to be closer to God, to follow the laws of his nation. And he gives no substance, no ground for their accusations. In verse 18, we see that they found him being purified in the temple without any crowd or tumult. Who accused him in the temple? Some Jews from Asia. You know, we like to think that sometimes the riots that we see when folks travel from other areas of the United States and stir something up, we like to think that that's a modern thing. It's not a modern thing at all, is it? People did that even way back when. People would travel a big distance to stir up a stink. And these Jews from Asia, who apparently still had a grudge against Paul from encounters earlier during his missionary journeys, they came down and stirred all this up. And you can kind of see Paul breaking his thought. So he's saying, some Jews from Asia, and then he said, well, wait a minute, they ought to be here because they're the ones that made the accusations. If they've got something to say, where are they? And of course, they weren't there.
And it should be an actual crime that they're saying I committed.
Should be an actual crime.
Not attempted, maybe, sorta, kinda.
Yeah.
None of that's illegal under Jewish law.
Yeah. No witnesses. Yeah. So what did Paul say his accuser should specify, and what did Paul omit to saying in 20 and 21? What should the accusers do?
Identify the crime.
Identify the crime. What did I do? What did I do? Where's the evidence? What did he admit to saying? Of course, I thought it was kind of a choice moment, didn't you? When he's meeting in the council and he sees the Pharisees and the Sadducees, two groups, and he lobs that emotional hand grenade out there in the middle of the group, and they tear into each other. And he says, yes, I believe in the resurrection. I'll admit to that. It is with respect to the resurrection of the dead that I'm on trial before you this day. Pretty interesting. So Tertullus lays out this case, this real flowery introduction, these accusations that are overstated and, at best, out and out lies, at worst, no witnesses at all, and then Paul makes his defense, which seems clear as crystal to me. Let's pick it up in 22 and 23. But Felix, having a rather accurate knowledge of the way, put them off, saying, "When Lysias the tribune comes down, I will decide your case." Then he gave orders to the centurion that he should be kept in custody, but have some liberty, and that none of his friends should be prevented from attending to his needs. Okay, so how much did Felix know about the way? Knew about it. Actually, it says a little bit more than that, doesn't it? Rather accurate knowledge. So he apparently had a fairly good understanding of that teaching. And maybe that plays into what we see later about his conversations with Paul. But he knew about the way. I don't know about you, but I really like that, the way. Followers of the way. Jesus said, "I am the way, the truth, and the light." Felix understood that. He understood about the way. How did Felix end this hearing? What does he say in 22? Oh, man, I cannot believe that bell rang. I'm just getting wound up. What's he say about how he's going to end it? Wants to hear from Lysias the tribune. So we know that he wants the person that was very closely involved with this, the Roman soldier that was involved with this very closely, he wants to hear from him, that he said he'll decide his case. What orders did he give Felix? Did Felix give the centurion regarding Paul there in verse 23? Kept in custody. And I looked that word up again. It could mean prison, but it generally means oversight kind of custody, and understanding that Paul was a Roman and they recognized this, it was probably more like protective custody. What did they say about Paul's friends? They could come, right? So his friends, he said that none of his friends should be prevented from attending to his needs. So it was okay for friends to come and visit Paul, to encourage him, to bring him food, whatever he needed. And Felix specified that in his orders to the centurion. Let's go, as we're wrapping up, we're not going to get all the way through the lesson today. Let's go to Acts 21 real quick, because this is when Paul first came through on his way to Jerusalem. Let's look at 8 through 16, 21, 8 through 16. I'll try to read this quickly. How am I doing? I've got 3 minutes. On the next day we departed and came to Caesarea, and we entered the house of Philip the evangelist, who was one of the 7, and stayed with him. He had 4 unmarried daughters who prophesied. While we were staying for many days, a prophet named Agabus came down from Judea. And coming to us, he took Paul's belt and bound his own feet and hands and said, "Thus says the Holy Spirit, this is how the Jews at Jerusalem will bind the man who owns this belt and deliver him into the hands of the Gentiles." When we heard this, we and all the people there urged him not to go up to Jerusalem. Then Paul answered, "What are you doing, weeping and breaking my heart? For I am ready not only to be in prison, but even to die in Jerusalem for the name of the Lord Jesus." And since he would not be persuaded, we ceased and said, "Let the will of the Lord be done." After these days we got ready and went up to Jerusalem, and some of the disciples from Caesarea went with us, bringing us to the house of Mnason of Cyprus, an early disciple with whom we should lodge. So we get a little bit of an idea of who those friends of Paul might be. They're not really mentioned anyplace else, but we know these people were in Caesarea, and they might be attending to Paul's needs. So I just thought it interesting. He's traveled to Caesarea, and at least I was asking myself, what friends does Paul have in Caesarea? And if you go back to 21, you kind of get a sense of the church, the people that Paul knew, in that area. Okay, let's see where we are next. No, we're going to have to pick it up in 24 next week because we've just got about a minute left. Any closing thoughts about this hearing that Paul has before Felix? Pretty amazing story, isn't it? I used to be a big Perry Mason fan when I was younger. Some of you probably don't even know who Perry Mason is, but you all remember Perry Mason pretty clearly, yeah. So there's something exciting about watching a case unfold in a courtroom, and in my view, Paul absolutely blows it out of the water. Tertullus is a big bag of hot air, and doesn't seem to be getting anywhere. But as we learned from Dr. Manor, Felix is not an especially upright person. So he's a little slanted in his thinking anyway. And we'll see that unfold in the coming text. Thank you all for your comments. We'll pick it up here next week.
Thanks, Jeff.
You're welcome.